The wind rolled through the dry fields like it had something to say. Dust lifted from the earth, swirling around a small wooden cabin that had seen too many winters and not enough love. The roof sagged in the middle, and the walls whispered with every gust. But to her it was home. Her name was Lila Mae Turner. 23, small in frame, proud in heart. The kind of woman who worked with cracked hands and a quiet strength that didn't need to be seen to be real. She'd inherited the land from her father, a freedman who'd spent his life breaking his back to own something no one could take away. Or so he thought. That morning, Lila stood barefoot in the dirt. Her cotton dress faded from too many washings. A folded paper shook in her hand. It carried words she could barely read, but she knew what they meant. Evik. Tage. She'd been behind on the payments since her father passed, and the drought had killed her crops before they ever had a chance. The few hens she had left weren't enough to trade for feed, and the well water was running low. But what tore her most wasn't the hunger. It was the fear of losing the only place her father ever called his own. She looked down the road, her throat tight. The sound of hooves came slow but certain, like the rhythm of a clock running out of time. The man who rode toward her was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the look of someone who didn't ask for permission to breathe. His coat was clean. His boots shone. His horse, a chestnut stallion, looked as if it had never known hunger. Everyone in town knew him. Elijah Carter, the richest rancher in 3 counties, owned half the valley and all the power that came with it. Folks said he was a fair man, but fairness had a price. A gun. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice deep, even. "You got my letters?" "Lila, no. You understand why I'm here." She swallowed hard. "I do." He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. He looked around the place. The broken fence, the patch of dying corn, the worn-out mule tied to a post. Then he looked at her straight and steady. "You can't pay, Lila. The bank already sold the deed. I bought it last month." Her breath hitched. "You bought my home?" He nodded once. "It's mine now, but I came to see if we could make some kind of arrangement." Her hands trembled around the paper. "Arrangement?" He stepped closer. "You've been on this land all your life. I know your daddy worked it honest. I ain't got no wish to turn you out on the road." He hesitated, eyes softening just a little. "Because business don't stop for sorrow, Miss Turner. Not in this world. I can't undo the deal, but I can offer you something different." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "Please, Mr. Carter. This is all I have. My daddy built this house with his hands. He said the dirt under our feet was our proof we belonged. Please don't take it." The words came out as a plea, quiet and raw, floating into the dry air between them. "Elijah studies." Finally, he spoke, low and certain. "Then you must be my wife." Lila's heart stopped. "What did you say?" "You know." She stared at him, stunned. The world seemed to tilt under her feet. He didn't smile, didn't joke. He just looked at her with the kind of seriousness that made her knees weak. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "I do," he said. "You keep the house. You keep the land. But you do it as Mrs. Carter." Silence hung between them, thick as smoke. The sound of the wind, the creak of the barn door. It all faded into something far away. Lila's heart pounded. "You think I'd marry the man who bought my home out from under me?" His jaw tensed. "I think you'd rather stay than sleep in the dust, Miss Turner. Game's that." She turned away, blinking fast to keep the tears from falling. "You think money lets you do anything, don't you?" He didn't answer. Lila stepped forward, fists clenched at her sides. "My daddy said a man's wealth don't make him worthy. His kindness does. Elijah." He tipped his hat, stepped back to his horse, and rode away without another word. When the sound of his hooves disappeared, Lila sank to her knees in the dirt. She looked at the house, old, cracked, falling apart, and felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest like a stone. That night she couldn't sleep. The moonlight slid across the wooden floor, silver and cold. Every shadow looked like her father watching, waiting for her to do the right thing. To walk away from everything her family built? or to marry a man she barely knew just to keep it. The next morning, she packed a small satchel. She walked into town head high, step slow. People watched her as she passed, whispering, some pitying, some judging. She didn't care. She found Elijah Carter at the general store, talking business with the clerk. When he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence. "I came to give you your answer," she said. He nodded once. "All right." Lila took a deep breath. "If I say yes, what kind of life would that be?" He looked her in the eyes. "A fair one. I won't treat you wrong. I don't make promises I can't keep, but I'll keep you safe. You'll have a home and you'll have your pride. That's all I can offer." She hesitated. "And if I say no?" He sighed softly. "Then I'll give you 2 weeks to pack." She stared at the floor for a long time, her voice trembling. "You're a hard man, Elijah Carter." He gave a small, sad smile. "The world made me that way." The store was quiet, except for the sound of the wind pushing through the doorframe. "Fine." His brows lifted. "All right, what?" "I'll marry you." The words felt like glass in her throat. Elijah didn't gloat or grin. He just nodded. "Tomorrow morning. The pastor's house. I'll send a carriage for you." When she left the store, her knees felt weak. People in town watched her with wide eyes. They'd all heard. News traveled faster than light in a place that small. That night, she sat by her father's old chair, hands clasped together, whispering a prayer she barely had the strength to finish. "Lord, don't let me lose myself trying to survive." The next day dawned golden and cruel. The air smelled of dust and sunlight. Lila wore her mother's old white dress, worn thin but still soft against her skin. The carriage came just as promised, polished and proud. When she arrived at the small chapel on the hill, Elijah was already there. He looked like a man carved from stone, calm, unreadable. The pastor waited, holding the old Bible between his hands. The ceremony was short. Simple words, quiet vows. No flowers, no music. Just two souls bound by need and something neither could name. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," Elijah didn't move right away. He looked at her, waiting for her to decide. Lila closed her eyes, took a breath, and nodded once. The kiss was soft, respectful, but heavy with things unsaid. She didn't know if she'd made the right choice. She only knew she couldn't watch her father's dream die. Days turned into weeks. She learned Elijah wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't easy either. He rose before dawn, worked hard, spoke little. He treated her kindly but with distance, as if afraid to let her too close. One Ev. "Who's that?" she asked quietly. "My, Lila, what? I have it. That N." But, as she looked at Elijah sitting inside by the lamplight, she whispered softly to herself, "If I'm to be his wife, I'll be one with pride." And from that night on, something began to change. Not just in the house, but in the hearts of both. The mornings on the Carter Ranch started before the sun rose. Lila woke to the sound of roosters, to the smell of dew on dry grass, to the distant rhythm of hooves striking dirt. The house was quiet but never empty. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of wind through the old windows, the sound of life trying to find peace. It had been a month since she became Mrs. Elijah Carter. Some days it still felt like she was playing a part in someone else's story. But then there were moments, small ones, when she'd catch Elijah looking at her across the table, not like a burden he'd taken in, but like a woman he was beginning to see. He didn't say much, but his silence wasn't cold anymore. It felt watchful, steady, like he was waiting for something to grow between them that words couldn't rush. One morning, while hanging the laundry behind the house, Lila noticed the workers slowing down their tasks. Men whispered and nodded toward the road. She turned, and saw 3 white men riding in from town, dust swirling behind them like a warning. Sheriff Dalton led the group, his hat low, his badge catching sunlight. The other 2 bank men rode with smug grins and polished boots. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Mornin', Mrs. Carter. Your husband around?" Lila straightened. "He's in the field." Dalton looked her up and down. "Fine woman like you shouldn't be workin' out here. You got fine taste in husbands." The way he said it made her skin crawl. Elijah appeared a moment later, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's this about?" The sheriff smirked. "Just making sure you understand the law. There's talk in town that some folks don't take kindly to you marrying a colored woman. Some think you shouldn't be owning as much land as you do. Makes people uneasy." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Then those people can stay uneasy." Dalton laughed under his breath. "You always were stubborn. But trouble's comin'. Folks don't like what they don't understand." Lila stepped closer, her chin lifted. "What they don't understand is that this land was earned, not given." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Careful now, miss. Pride's a dangerous thing in this county." Elijah moved between them. "That'll be all, Sheriff." The men turned and rode off, laughter echoing down the road. When they were gone, Elijah's hands were still shaking. "You shouldn't talk to men like that," he said quietly. "They'll twist your words." "And you think staying quiet will keep them from hating us?" she snapped. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. "I just want to keep you safe." "Safety without respect ain't life, Elijah," she said softly. "It's just survival." That night, neither of them slept much. The world outside seemed too big, too cruel, and yet, inside that small house, something fierce was growing, something like hope. Days passed. Lila worked alongside the ranch hands, earning their respect one sweat-soaked hour at a time. She cooked for them, bandaged their cuts, laughed when they teased her about running the place better than the boss himself. Elijah watched her slowly turn the ranch into a home. She painted the front door blue, planted roses her father once loved, and filled the air with the sound of gospel hums that made even the hardest hearts soften. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned black, wind howling through the plains like a lost soul. Elijah rushed to tie down the livestock while Lila ran to close the shutters. Lightning cracked the sky open, and in that moment of light, she saw movement by the barn. 3 figures hiding behind the fence. She froze. Then a gunshot split the air. Elijah shouted her name. She dropped to the floor as glass shattered above her head. The storm drowned the noise, but she could hear men yelling outside. "Teach that man what happens when he forgets his place." Another gunshot. Her heart pounded. She crawled toward the window, saw Elijah take cover behind a wagon, firing warning shots into the dark. The rain poured harder, thunder shaking the earth. She ran to the old cabinet, grabbed her father's shotgun, loaded it with trembling hands. When she stepped out onto the porch, the rain hit her face like needles, but she didn't stop. "You leave him be," she shouted into the night. A voice called back, cruel and drunk. "Go inside, woman. Ain't your fight. It's my home," she cried. Lightning flashed again, revealing her standing tall in her soaked dress, the gun steady in her arms. "And I'll die before I see it stolen again." Silence fell between the crashes of thunder. Then one man cursed, another shouted, and suddenly they were gone, retreating into the dark. Elijah ran to her, pulling her close, his breath ragged. "Lila, you could have been killed." "So could you," she whispered, tears mixing with rain. "And I wasn't about to watch it happen." He held her tighter, and for the first time, he kissed her not out of duty but out of something real. Something that had been growing since the day she begged him not to take her home. The storm passed by morning, leaving the ranch scarred but standing. Word of what happened spread fast. Some folks said the Carters were cursed. Others said they were brave. But no one dared cross them again. Over time, the whispers in town quieted. Lila's courage had earned a kind of respect even the cruelest tongues couldn't undo. Elijah saw it too. He began inviting the neighboring families, black and white alike, to work together on his land, paying fair wages, sharing harvests. People still talked, but slowly the valley started to change. Lila and Elijah learned to live side by side, not as strangers bound by a bargain, but as 2 hearts that had found strength in each other's scars. One autumn evening, as the sun sank low and gold dust danced in the air, Elijah took her hand and led her to the hill overlooking the fields. The earth was alive with color, amber, rust, deep green. You remember what you told me that day? He asked quietly. That your daddy said kindness makes a man worthy. She nodded. I remember. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself rich, he said, voice rough with emotion. But you made me want to be worthy. Lila smiled, eyes glistening. You already are. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper. What's that? She asked. The deed, he said, to this land. It's in your name now. Her lips parted, tears falling before she could speak. Elijah? This was never about owning, he said softly. It was about belonging. And you've shown me what that means. She threw her arms around him, sobbing against his chest as the wind moved through the tall grass. The setting sun wrapped them in light like forgiveness. From that day on, folks in the valley spoke of Lila Mae Carter, the woman who turned a deal into a destiny, who stood her ground when the world tried to move her. She and Elijah built more than a ranch. They built a home that became a refuge for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Years later, when people asked her how it all began, Lila would smile, her voice soft as the wind that still carried dust across the fields. It began with a man who thought he was savant me, she'd say. But the truth is, I saved him too. And in that wild stretch of western sky, where land met freedom, their love became the kind of story people whispered about for generations. A story of pride, courage, and two hearts that refused to be broken. The mornings on the Carter Ranch started before the sun rose. Lila woke to the sound of roosters, to the smell of dew on dry grass, to the distant rhythm of hooves striking dirt. The house was quiet but never empty. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of wind through the old windows, the sound of life trying to find peace. It had been a month since she became Mrs. Elijah Carter. Some days it still felt like she was playing a part in someone else's story. But then there were moments, small ones, when she'd catch Elijah looking at her across the table, not like a burden he'd taken in, but like a woman he was beginning to see. He didn't say much, but his silence wasn't cold anymore. It felt watchful, steady, like he was waiting for something to grow between them that words couldn't rush. One morning, while hanging the laundry behind the house, Lila noticed the workers slowing down their tasks. Men whispered and nodded toward the road. She turned, and saw 3 white men riding in from town, dust swirling behind them like a warning. Sheriff Dalton led the group, his hat low, his badge catching sunlight. The other 2 bank men rode with smug grins and polished boots. The sheriff tipped his hat. Mornin', Mrs. Carter. Your husband around. Lila straightened. He's in the field. Dalton looked her up and down. Fine woman like you shouldn't be workin' out here. You got fine taste in husbands. The way he said it made her skin crawl. Elijah appeared a moment later, wiping sweat from his brow. What's this about? The sheriff smirked. Just making sure you understand the law. There's talk in town that some folks don't take kindly to you marrying a colored woman. Some think you shouldn't be ownin' as much land as you do. Makes people uneasy. Elijah's jaw tightened. Then those people can stay uneasy. Dalton laughed under his breath. You always were stubborn. But trouble's comin'. Folks don't like what they don't understand. Lila stepped closer, her chin lifted. What they don't understand is that this land was earned, not given. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Careful now, miss. Pride's a dangerous thing in this county. Elijah moved between them. That'll be all, Sheriff. The men turned and rode off, laughter echoing down the road. When they were gone, Elijah's hands were still shaking. You shouldn't talk to men like that, he said quietly. They'll twist your words. And you think staying quiet will keep them from hating us? She snapped. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. I just want to keep you safe. Safety without respect ain't life, Elijah, she said softly. It's just survival. That night, neither of them slept much. The world outside seemed too big, too cruel. And yet, inside that small house, something fierce was growing. Something like hope. Days passed. Lila worked alongside the ranch hands, earning their respect one sweat-soaked hour at a time. She cooked for them, bandaged their cuts, laughed when they teased her about running the place better than the boss himself. Elijah watched her slowly turn the ranch into a home. She painted the front door blue, planted roses her father once loved, and filled the air with the sound of gospel hums that made even the hardest hearts soften. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned black, wind howling through the plains like a lost soul. Elijah rushed to tie down the livestock while Lila ran to close the shutters. Lightning cracked the sky open, and in that moment of light, she saw movement by the barn. 3 figures hiding behind the fence. She froze. Then a gunshot split the air. Elijah shouted her name. She dropped to the floor as glass shattered above her head. The storm drowned the noise, but she could hear men yelling outside. Teach that man what happens when he forgets his place. Another gunshot. Her heart pounded. She crawled toward the window, saw Elijah take cover behind a wagon, firing warning shots into the dark. The rain poured harder, thunder shaking the earth. She ran to the old cabinet, grabbed her father's shotgun, loaded it with trembling hands. When she stepped out onto the porch, the rain hit her face like needles, but she didn't stop. "You leave him be!" she shouted into the night. A voice called back, cruel and drunk. "Go inside, woman. Ain't your fight. It's my home," she cried. Lightning flashed again, revealing her standing tall in her soaked dress, the gun steady in her arms. "And I'll die before I see it stolen again." Silence fell between the crashes of thunder. Then one man cursed, another shouted, and suddenly they were gone, retreating into the dark. Elijah ran to her, pulling her close, his breath ragged. "Lila, you could have been killed." "So could you," she whispered, tears mixing with rain. "And I wasn't about to watch it happen." He held her tighter, and for the first time, he kissed her not out of duty but out of something real. Something that had been growing since the day she begged him not to take her home. The storm passed by morning, leaving the ranch scarred but standing. Word of what happened spread fast. Some folks said the Carters were cursed. Others said they were brave. But no one dared cross them again. Over time, the whispers in town quieted. Lila's courage had earned a kind of respect even the cruelest tongues couldn't undo. Elijah saw it too. He began inviting the neighboring families, black and white alike, to work together on his land, paying fair wages, sharing harvests. People still talked, but slowly the valley started to change. Lila and Elijah learned to live side by side, not as strangers bound by a bargain, but as 2 hearts that had found strength in each other's scars. One autumn evening, as the sun sank low and gold dust danced in the air, Elijah took her hand and led her to the hill overlooking the fields. The earth was alive with color, amber, rust, deep green. "You remember what you told me that day?" he asked quietly. "That your daddy said kindness makes a man worthy." She nodded. "I remember. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself rich," he said, voice rough with emotion. "But you made me want to be worthy." Lila smiled, eyes glistening. "You already are." He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper. "What's that?" she asked. "The deed," he said, "to this land. It's in your name now." Her lips parted, tears falling before she could speak. "Elijah, this was never about owning," he said softly. "It was about belonging. And you've shown me what that means." She threw her arms around him, sobbing against his chest as the wind moved through the tall grass. The setting sun wrapped them in light like forgiveness. From that day on, folks in the valley spoke of Lila Mae Carter, the woman who turned a deal into a destiny, who stood her ground when the world tried to move her. She and Elijah built more than a ranch. They built a home that became a refuge for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Years later, when people asked her how it all began, Lila would smile, her voice soft as the wind that still carried dust across the fields. "It began with a man who thought he was savant me," she'd say. "But the truth is, I saved him too." And in that wild stretch of western sky, where land met freedom, their love became the kind of story people whispered about for generations. A story of pride, courage, and two hearts that refused to be broken. The years after Elijah's passing moved like quiet rivers, slow but sure, carving memory into everything they touched. The ranch stood tall through it all, weathered, sturdy, alive with the laughter of new generations. Time had changed the valley, but the land still carried their names like a heartbeat. Carter Ranch. Lila Mae Carter was old now, her hair silver as frost, her eyes soft but still sharp. Every morning, she sat on the porch with a wool shawl around her shoulders, watching the sunrise spread over the fields Elijah once plowed. She still talked to him sometimes, soft and gentle, like he was just beyond the horizon. "You'd be proud of this place," she'd whisper. "It's still standin', still free." Her voice carried on the wind, and sometimes she swore she could hear it echo back. Children ran through the yard, some hers by blood, others by bond. The Carter land had become a safe haven for anyone who needed one. Orphans, travelers, poor families from nearby counties. They all found room under Lila's roof. She never turned anyone away. "Every soul needs a start," she'd say. "The Lord gave me mine when I thought it was the end." Among those who lived there was a boy named Isaiah. He was 12 when he arrived, quiet and wide-eyed, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and a scar across his arm from a fire he never spoke about. Lila saw something of herself in him. The same fear, the same stubborn spark. She took him under her wing, taught him to ride, to plant, to believe in his worth. Over the years, Isaiah grew strong. He worked the land like it was his calling, treating every inch of soil with reverence. Sometimes, he'd look at Lila with the kind of respect that made her heart ache with pride. "Miss Lila," he said one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills. "When you go on to heaven, what's going to happen to this place?" She smiled faintly, turning her gaze to the horizon. "It'll live. Maybe not in my hands, but in yours or someone like you. This land don't belong to me no more. It belongs to the people who remember why it mattered." "Why did it matter?" he asked softly. "Because it taught us we're more than what the world calls us," she said. "They said we didn't belong, and we made belonging look like home." He nodded slowly, like he was memorizing her words. Years passed and the seasons rolled on. The world beyond the valley grew faster. Railroads, cities, factories. But inside the Carter land, time seemed to keep its own rhythm. One summer day, a group of strangers came riding through, historians young and eager, carrying notebooks and cameras. They said they'd come to hear the story of the woman who defied the railroad and built a legacy from dust. Lila welcomed them with tea and cornbread, laughing softly at all the fuss. "Ain't much to tell that the wind don't already know," she said, but still she spoke. She told them of her father's dream, of Elijah's pride, of the night fire lit up the sky, and how love had turned fear into freedom. They listened like children at her feet, writing every word as if it were scripture. One of them asked, "Do you regret anything, Miss Lila?" She looked out across the fields, the golden sway, the soft hum of life, and shook her head. "No, not a thing. I begged a man not to take my home, and instead he gave me a life. We didn't start with love, but we built it like a house, one board at a time. And that's what lasted." That night, when everyone had gone, Lila sat by Elijah's grave under the oak tree. The stars stretched wide above her, and the wind moved through the grass like a hymn. "You hear 'em, Elijah?" she whispered. "They're tellin' our story now. Guess we did something right." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she smiled through it. "You'd laugh if you saw the world today. They got machines that fly, and music that comes out of little boxes. But the one thing that ain't changed, folks still trying to find a place where they belong." She leaned back, eyes on the stars, and whispered, "We found ours, didn't we?" The night answered in stillness, soft and eternal. The next morning, Isaiah came to bring her breakfast. The porch was quiet, her chair rocking gently in the breeze. Lila had gone peacefully in her sleep, her hands folded, her face serene. On the table beside her was a letter, written in her careful hand, addressed to Isaiah. He opened it with trembling fingers. It read, "My dear Isaiah, when I am gone, don't you cry for me. This land is yours now and all who need it. Keep it good. Keep it honest. And never let anyone tell you your worth is less than the ground beneath your feet. I once begged a man to let me stay, but I learned that home ain't something given. It's something we build together. Build it well. Lila Mae Carter. Isaiah pressed the letter to his chest, tears falling quietly. He buried her beside Elijah, under the oak that had seen every chapter of their story. The whole valley came to say goodbye. Black and white, rich and poor. They all stood side by side, proof that her life had changed more than just her own. After that day, Isaiah took care of the ranch. He ran it the way she taught him, with fairness, strength, and a heart full of faith. He built a small schoolhouse nearby, naming it Lila Carter Academy, where children learned not just to read and write, but to understand who they were and where they came from. The Carter name became legend, carried on the wind like truth that refused to die. Years later, travelers still came through the valley. They'd see the blue door, the roses, the fields that stretched forever, and they'd stop to ask, who lived here? And the old folks would smile and say, a woman who refused to lose her home, and a man who learned what home truly meant. They'd tell the story again and again, because some stories ain't meant to fade. They're meant to root themselves deep in the land, growing stronger with every telling. On the anniversary of her passing, Isaiah stood on that same porch, now older, grayer, but unbroken. The sun painted the fields gold, and he whispered to the sky, Miss Lila, it's still standin', just like you said it would. A soft wind brushed past him, warm and full of memory. It carried the faintest sound, a woman's laughter, gentle and proud. Somewhere in that endless sky, Lila Mae Carter and Elijah Carter were home again. Together, their love stretching beyond time. The land they fought for stood not as property, but as a promise, that even the poorest voice, when it speaks with courage, can echo forever. And long after their names faded from paper, their story remained written in the earth itself, where no one could erase it. Decades passed, and the world outside the valley turned unrecognizable. Cities had grown like iron forests, and the sound of train whistles no longer echoed across lonely plains, but through crowded streets and busy hearts. Yet far away, beyond the noise and glass, the Carter land still breathed, still golden, still sacred. Isaiah Carter was an old man now, his hair silver, his shoulders bent from a lifetime of work, but his spirit was pure fire. Every morning he rose before dawn, walked out to the porch where Lila once sat, and poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for the memory of the woman who had saved them all. Morning, Miss Lila, he'd say softly, setting the cup beside her empty chair. Sun's comin' up again. Guess that means we made it through another night. The porch creaked like it was answering him, and sometimes he swore he could feel her presence in the morning wind. Gentle, reassuring, proud. The ranch was more than a home now. It had become a refuge for souls the world forgot. Veterans, wanderers, lost children, mothers with nowhere else to go. Isaiah never turned them away. He'd say, Miss Lila didn't fight to save this place just for herself. She saved it for all of us. Folks came from as far as Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi just to see it. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a story that refused to die. But to Isaiah it was simply family. One autumn evening, a stranger rode in on a dusty gray horse. A young woman, skin deep brown like the earth after rain, eyes full of questions. She wore city clothes that didn't fit the land. A long coat, polished boots. But her heart, Isaiah could tell, belonged somewhere far more honest. You the one they call Mr. Carter? She asked. That's what they used to call me, he said with a small grin. Ain't much Mr. left in me now. She smiled shyly, then looked out toward the fields. My name's Lena. My grandma used to tell me stories about this place. Said her great-grandma was raised here after the war. Said this was where she learned what freedom meant. Isaiah nodded slowly. Ain't surprised. Lot of folks pass through here lookin' for something they lost. She hesitated, then said softly, I'm a writer. I want to tell their story, your story. The story of Lila Mae Carter. The old man froze, his breath catching. He hadn't heard her name spoken by someone new in years. You sure you ready for that? He asked. Her story ain't all pretty. It's got pain, loss, fire, and a whole lot of tears. Lena smiled. That's exactly why it should be told. Isaiah looked at her for a long moment, then motioned for her to sit. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and sorrow. He began to speak, his voice deep and slow, carrying the rhythm of time itself. I wasn't born when she came here, but I been livin' in her shadow all my life. Miss Lila was the kind of woman who didn't bend easy. She fought for this land when nobody believed she could. She stood up to power and didn't flinch. She loved a man who was supposed to be her enemy, and together, they turned this dirt into something sacred. Lena listened for hours, writing every word, her pen racing like her heartbeat. She could almost see Lila in her mind. The proud young woman standing in front of a rancher's gate, dirt on her face, hope in her eyes. Isaiah told her about the night the barn burned, the day Lila refused to run, the letter she left behind. When he finished, silence settled between them, thick and reverent. Then Isaiah said softly, the thing about stories like this, they don't end. They just change hands. A week later, Isaiah passed away in his sleep, peaceful, the same way Lila had. They found him on the porch, hat resting on his chest, that same old letter from Lila tucked in his hand. He'd been reading it again, it seemed, right before he drifted off. The townsfolk buried him beside her and Elijah under the old oak tree. The wind that day felt warm, almost alive, carrying the whisper of a promise that love and justice don't die. They just take root. Lena stayed behind to finish her writing. She moved into the farmhouse, kept it just as Isaiah had, the blue door polished, the garden blooming. Every night she sat on that porch and wrote by lantern light. Her book became a work of truth and tenderness, not just about one woman or one ranch, but about every black soul who had ever been told they didn't belong, and who built belonging anyway. When it was published, it spread like wildfire. Readers from all over America, from New Orleans to Chicago, from Houston to Harlem, wept and whispered over those pages. They said, "It feels like I've been here before." One morning, a reporter asked Lena why she'd written it. She smiled and said, "Because they begged the world not to take their home, and in the end, they gave us all one." The Carter Ranch became a living museum. People came not just to see the land, but to feel it, to touch the wood Elijah carved, to smell the roses Lila planted, to stand beneath the oak where they rested. School children would walk barefoot through the soil, and teachers would tell them, "This is where freedom learned to grow." Years later, as an old woman, Lena sat where Lila once had, watching a new generation of children run through the fields. A little girl climbed onto her lap one afternoon and asked, "Miss Lena, were they real? Lila and Elijah?" Lena smiled, her eyes misty. "Oh, they were real, baby, as real as the sun. But more than that, they were what the world could be when people choose love over power." The girl frowned softly. "Did they ever get tired?" Lena laughed gently. "All the time. But love ain't about never getting tired. It's about never quittin'." As the evening came and the cicadas sang, Lena looked up at the sky and whispered, "You see this, Miss Lila? They still comin'. They still learnin'. You didn't just save a home. You saved a people's hope." The wind stirred, brushing her cheek like a blessing. She closed her eyes and smiled, feeling something sacred move through the air, as if generations were speaking all at once. And as the night fell quiet over the Carter land, the old house stood proud and peaceful, bathed in moonlight. Somewhere between the creak of the porch and the whisper of the trees, you could almost hear them, Lila's laughter, Elijah's low hum, Isaiah's gentle prayer, the sound of a story that never ended. Because when a poor girl once pleaded, "Please don't take my home," she wasn't just fighting for a roof. She was fighting for every soul who ever needed a place to belong. And when the rich rancher said, "Then you must be my wife," he wasn't just offering her a name. He was choosing redemption, unity, and love over everything the world told him to be. And that choice, that small human act, became legend, not written in stone or law, but in hearts that still beat with pride, still remember what it took to stand, to love, and to never let go. Years passed, and the Carter story traveled farther than the old dirt roads ever could. Lena's book became more than just a bestseller. It became a voice. Colleges taught it, churches read it, families passed it down like a keepsake. It wasn't just the story of a poor girl and a rancher. It was a reminder of what America could be if people chose grace over greed, love over fear. Generations who had never known the sound of horses' hooves or the taste of dust from a Texas plain felt something when they read about Lila May. They saw her courage in their own grandmothers, her pride in their own reflection, her hope in their own survival. But time never stops. The world grew louder, faster. Buildings rose where grass once waved. Children forgot the smell of open fields. And still, the Carter land stood quietly under the same endless sky. The blue door now faded but still unbroken. The Carter name had become a foundation, a legend told in schools, in songs, in spoken word gatherings where poets whispered. She fought the world with nothing but her dignity, and won. One summer, long after Lena had passed on, a young filmmaker named Jalen Brooks arrived at the ranch. He was 28, from Chicago, with eyes that held both fire and gentleness. His grandmother had made him read Lena's book when he was 10, saying, "Remember, baby, this is where we came from." Now he'd come to turn that story into a film, to let the world see what the pages had only told. He stepped onto the land like stepping into holy ground. The air smelled of wild sage and rain-soaked soil, and something in his chest stirred, like he was walking through memory, not earth. He ran his fingers along the old porch rail, the wood smooth where countless hands had rested. "This is it," he whispered. "This is where it all began." The caretaker, an old man who had tended the land for years, nodded. "You making a movie, son?" "Yes, sir," Jalen said. "About Miss Lila." The man smiled faintly. "Then make sure you tell it right. Don't make her a saint, make her real. She bled for this place." Jalen nodded. "That's exactly what I want people to feel." The production took months. The cast was small but powerful. Faces rich with soul, voices full of truth. They filmed the fire, the rain, the pleading at the gate. They filmed Elijah's silence, his redemption, the love that grew not from beauty, but from bravery. Every frame breathed. Every line carried the weight of history. When the film premiered, it was in a small theater in Houston. The audience sat silent through the credits, no one daring to move. Then an older woman in the front row began to clap, slow and steady, her hands trembling. Soon the whole room followed, not just clapping but standing. Some weeping, some smiling, all moved beyond words. Jalen stood at the back, tears streaming down his face. He had done what he came to do. He had brought them back to life. That night, as he walked alone under the city lights, he called his grandmother. "Nana," he said, voice cracking. "They loved it. They really loved it." Her voice came soft and proud. "I told you, baby, truth don't die. It just waits for someone brave enough to tell it again." The film spread like wildfire, not just in theaters, but in hearts. People across America began to visit the Carter Ranch again. Families of every color, walking the fields in silence, feeling the story rise through the ground. Teachers used it to talk about justice, pastors used it to preach forgiveness, and children began to dream of courage the way Lila once dreamed of home. In time, a new foundation was built on that land. The Carter Home for Dignity and Learning, a sanctuary for girls with nowhere else to go. They came from cities and small towns, some carrying nothing but pain, some running from storms the world couldn't see. But here they found peace. The walls were painted soft yellow. The air smelled of baked bread and lavender. And on the wall by the entrance hung a single framed sentence. She begged not to lose her home, so she gave one to everyone else. Every morning, the girls would gather outside under the oak tree where Lila and Elijah rested. They'd hold hands and pray, not out of ritual, but gratitude. The director of the home, A woman named Angela, who'd once been a runaway herself, would tell them, "You're standing on a promise. This land knows pain, but it also knows power. Whatever you came here carrying, you can lay it down. You're home now." One rainy afternoon, a girl named Tiana sat alone by the window, tears streaming down her face. She'd just turned 16 and was afraid of everything. Of her past, her future, of being seen. Angela sat beside her quietly. "You know who this house is named after?" she asked. Tiana nodded. "Lila Carter." "That's right," Angela said. "You know what she said once?" Tiana shook her head. Angela smiled softly. She said, "Home ain't something you're given. It's something you build. So let's build yours together. Okay?" Tiana it. Years later, Tiana would become the director of the Carter home. She would walk through the halls with confidence, her voice strong, her smile bright. She'd tell new girls, "A long time ago, a poor woman begged the world not to take her home. And now, every time one of you steps through that door, she gets to keep it." One evening, when the sun was setting, Tiana stood by the oak tree. The air was golden, quiet, full of memory. "Miss Lila," she whispered, "I don't know if you can hear me, but we're still here. Your house still stands. Your love still works." The leaves rustled softly above her, and for a moment, it felt like the whole land was breathing with her. Some say when the moon is full, and the wind moves just right, you can still see them. A young woman and a tall man walking hand in hand through the fields, their faces peaceful, their laughter floating through the night air like song. But whether or not that's true don't matter much. What matters is this. A story born from pain became a home built on love. And though time keeps rolling, though names fade and years fall away, the Carter Ranch still stands. A monument not of wealth, but of will. A place where a poor girl once pleaded to be seen, and ended up teaching the world how to stand proud. And if you ever find yourself lost, far from where you belong, remember her words, whispered through generations, carried on the wind. Don't let them take your home. Not the one made of walls, but the one made of hope. Because hope, that's the one thing no one can take unless you give it away. By the time the century turned, the Carter name had grown into something more than a story. It had become a light people carried in their hearts. Generations who never saw the old farmhouse or felt the Texas dust between their fingers still spoke of it like sacred truth. The Carter home had expanded into a network, centers across the South, each one teaching young people pride, history, and the power of dignity. They called it the Lila Mae Foundation, a hymn. One cold February morning, in Atlanta, a young woman named Zora Brooks stood before a crowd of hundreds inside the city's old community theater. Behind her hung a banner with Lila's faded photograph. Dark eyes, firm mouth, strength shining from every line. Zora was 25, sharp as steel, raised in foster care and once homeless. Now, she was a speaker, a teacher, and the youngest director the foundation ever had. She looked out at the crowd, at the mothers, the sons, the dreamers, and began to speak. "When I was 15, she said, I had nowhere to go. I slept in a shelter that leaked when it rained. I thought I'd never have a place that was mine. But then I read about a woman named Lila Mae Carter, a poor girl who begged a man not to take her home. And instead of breaking, she built something that couldn't be taken. Later that night, she walked alone through the quiet streets. The air smelled of rain and possibility. She stopped by a mural painted on the side of a brick building. A mural of Lila standing in her long dress, holding a lantern against the night. Underneath it were words in white paint. She built her home so others could rest. Zora touched the wall softly. "I'll keep it going," she whispered. "I promise." Across the country, similar moments were happening. People touched by Lila's legacy, building new homes, new dreams, new courage. In Detroit, a group of young men opened a carpentry school named Carter and Sons in Massa's Fields of Freedom, using soil from the Carter land in her pigments. In Oakland, a teacher created a scholarship for girls who wanted to study history, called the Lila Mae Grant for Dignity and Justice. And then came the day the world seemed to pause, when the President of the United States stood on national television and spoke about her. It was during a Black History Month address. Cameras flashed, the room hushed. "There was once a woman named Lila Mae Carter," the president said. "She was poor, uneducated, and forgotten. But she refused to let the world take her home. She fought not with violence, but with love, not for power, but for belonging." And today, her story reminds us what America was meant to be. A place where even the smallest voice can change the course of history. In that moment, the Carter story was no longer just history. It became heritage. At the ranch, now a national landmark, a new visitor center had been built. It was run by Tiana, gray-haired but strong, her eyes bright with purpose. She guided children through the rooms where Lila had once prayed and Elijah had once worked, showing them the old letters, the wooden cradle, the faded photographs. "This," she'd say, touching a framed piece of wood from the original fence, "is more than timber, it's testimony." Outside, under the oak tree, stood a marble monument carved with words Lila once said, "Don't take my home. Let me make one with you." Every year on the anniversary of Lila's plea, hundreds gathered on that land. They came with music and prayer, laughter and tears. Choirs sang gospel songs that floated across the fields, while elders told stories of how their families found strength through her legacy. Children ran barefoot through the grass, shouting and laughing, unaware they were treading on sacred ground. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Zora stood beneath the oak tree with a small child in her arms, her daughter, barely a year old. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the warmth of memory. She looked down at her baby's face, soft and full of promise, and whispered, "You come from a line of builders, baby. We don't run when they come for what's ours. We plant our feet, lift our heads, and say, 'This is home.'" The wind stirred through the leaves, and somewhere deep in that sound, Zora could almost hear Lila's voice, strong, calm, filled with that old courage. "Keep it standing," it said. "Keep it honest." And so she did. In the years that followed, the foundation grew even larger, stretching beyond America's borders. It built homes for refugees, schools for girls, centers for peace. Every one of them carried a small plaque that read, "Inspired by Lila Mae Carter, a woman who believed in home." Artists, writers, and dreamers carried her name into songs and poems. There was a blues singer in New Orleans who wrote, "She begged for mercy, but found her crown." A PR, "If Lila could build a home from dust, what excuse we got not to build from hope?" And an elder in a small Texas church simply whispered during service, "She was the kind of woman God sends when the world forgets what love looks like." On the 150th anniversary of her birth, a crowd of thousands gathered at the ranch. Descendants of Elijah and Lila, alongside families whose lives had been touched by their legacy, stood shoulder to shoulder. The president, pastors, poets, and children all came to speak. And when the choir began to sing "Wade in the Water," voices rose across the valley like thunder. Old and young, black and white, rich and poor, together, the way she always dreamed it would be. That night, when the last candle burned low and the crowd had gone home, the valley returned to stillness. The moon hung over the fields, silver and full, and in that sacred quiet, a soft wind passed through, brushing the grass in slow waves. Some said they saw two figures walking hand in hand through the mist. A man in a worn hat, a woman in a simple dress, their faces peaceful, their steps steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The land spoke for them. It whispered the same promise it had kept for centuries. That home is not walls or names or fences. It's the space where love stands tall, unbroken. The day broke soft and quiet, like the land itself had finally taken a breath after a long storm. Dawn painted gold across the hills, brushing the tips of the cottonwoods, touching the porch where Clara sat with a mug of black coffee in her hands. Her eyes drifted across the open plain, the one she had almost lost, the one she had fought to keep, the one that had become her home again. The smell of earth and hay wrapped around her like an old blanket. The ranch was alive now. Laughter carried from the barn, Hooves beat lightly against the soil, and somewhere behind her, Samuel was humming, low and rough, like a man still learning how to live with peace after a lifetime of pride and regret. She turned her head when she felt his steps. He walked toward her, slower now, with a gentleness she had never imagined from him in those early days when he stood tall and hard against her tears. "Coffee's cold," he said, taking the mug from her hand, sipping anyway. "Then warm it yourself," she teased softly. He smiled, eyes crinkling like the corners of old paper. "I did," he said, and bent to kiss her forehead. It wasn't a grand love story, not the kind the city folk would write songs about. It was built from quieter things. Broken fences, shared chores, nights sitting in silence, hands finding each other not out of need but choice. He had bought the land once out of power, but he had stayed out of love. And she, who once begged not to lose her home, had found something she didn't even know she was missing. Someone who looked at her and saw strength, not charity. Weeks turned to months, and the ranch grew into something that reflected both of them. Clara's garden bloomed again, wildflowers trailing along the fence like soft rebellion against the wind. The townsfolk who once whispered about her, the poor girl who married the rich man, had come to see the truth. She wasn't the girl they pitied. She was the woman who rebuilt what life had tried to strip away. Some of them came to ask for her help. Others just came to listen, drawn by the quiet power in her voice. She'd offer them tea, listen to their troubles, and say the same thing that had guided her through every storm. Don't let anyone tell you your worth comes from what you own. It comes from what you endure. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of copper, a young boy rode up from town with a letter. Clara took it with curious eyes, opened it slowly. The letter was from the bank, the same one that once tried to take her home. But this time it wasn't a notice. It was a request. They wanted her help managing land disputes between settlers. Said she had a reputation now for fairness and grace. She laughed softly, not out of pride, but disbelief at how life could twist and circle back like a river. Samuel looked at her from across the table. "You always did have more sense than the rest of us," he said. She looked up, a hint of mischief in her smile. "Took you long enough to notice." Later that night, when the stars scattered bright over the wide sky, Samuel sat beside her on the porch steps. The silence was easy, filled with the sound of crickets and the wind through the grass. "Clara," he said quietly, "when I first saw you standing there, begging for that house, I thought I was doing you a favor." She turned to him, brows raised, but he continued, eyes lost somewhere beyond the horizon. "But you were the one who saved me. You made this place a home. You gave it a soul." Clara's eyes softened, a smile touching her lips. "No," she said, "we did that together. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And I gave you a reason to see beyond yourself." He nodded slowly, and the quiet stretched between them, comfortable and deep. Then he whispered, "Guess we both learned that home ain't just wood and land. It's where someone fights for you, even when you've stopped fighting for yourself." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And sometimes," she murmured, "it's where forgiveness finds you when you least expect it." Years later, the story of Clara and Samuel became something of a legend in that little corner of the West. Folks said their ranch was blessed, that crops grew greener, that horses lived longer, that laughter stayed there longer than most places. Travelers passing through would stop by just to see the woman who once lost everything and found something greater. She'd smile and welcome them, her hands still rough from work, but her eyes soft with peace. And on some evenings, when the light hit just right and the air carried the smell of rain, Clara would walk the land's edge, remembering the girl who once stood in the dust, begging not to lose her home. She'd think of the man who answered not with cruelty, but with a strange, wild kind of mercy that grew into love. When Samuel passed years later, the townspeople filled the church to the brim. Men who had once mocked him stood with their hats in hand. Women who once pitied her wiped quiet tears. Clara stood strong, her dress plain, her hands clasped tight. When it came time to speak, she stepped forward, voice steady. He wasn't an easy man. she said softly. But he learned. He listened. And he loved in the way only a man who's known loss can love. He gave me back my home, and I gave him his heart. When But everyone agreed on one thing. She never left her home again. Because in the end, her home wasn't the house, the land, or the fences. It was the life she built from ashes, the love she grew from defiance, and the peace she found in forgiveness.